This morning's sermon is an opportunity to learn more about the Filipino people and to hear how our family has responded to God's call by carrying their burdens and sharing their blessings. The conditions of life for Ruth and Naomi are like the conditions of the Filipino people. Rural peasants and indigenous peoples depend on the land for their food and work. In most cases, women depend on men and the family structure that is dominated by men to provide for them and their well-being. Girls and women are more likely to work the land instead of going to school. Women can never own land, and men also work the land, but they will never own it because of a landowner and an economic system that prevents them. Now, for some indigenous peoples, the ancestral land that they claim as home is under threat because the Philippine government and military would prefer to develop this land for their commercial purposes. While working the land, women are vulnerable to harassment and other forms of violence from their employer or co-workers who take advantage of them. But not everyone in the Philippines lives off the land. Everyone, however, is seeking to live, to survive, and to thrive. Some migrate from rural and other far-flung provinces to try to make a living in the big cities, while others will migrate abroad. All of this to escape the burdens of poverty and bring more blessings for their families. Working in the big cities and in countries outside of the Philippines help Filipinos to pay for food, school fees, as well as medicine and medical bills. The global pandemic has challenged the will to survive for overseas Filipino workers, OFWs, even as the famine confronted Ruth, Naomi, and Orpah with their tough decisions about how to survive. Some overseas Filipino workers are still abroad, working or unemployed. Others are trying to come back home to the Philippines, while others are in quarantine facilities, waiting to go home, waiting for COVID test results. And others have been reunited with their families in the Philippines. Sensing God's call to serve with the Filipino people and the people of other Southeast Asian countries, our family moved to the Philippines in March in 2016. These early years have introduced me to people in churches and organizations that support migrant workers, these overseas Filipino workers and their families. And although we live in the Philippines, I've had the privilege of traveling to different regions around the Philippines, as well as other countries, such as Hong Kong, Thailand, and Indonesia, and Sri Lanka, and Nepal, the United Arab Emirates, Morocco, and Ecuador. Although I've visited many places, my home and my heart is in the Philippines and serves as my frame of reference, as the baseline in understanding our mission work. The vulnerability and resilience of the Filipino people, especially the young girls and women, remind me of Ruth and Naomi. And the bold generosity of our colleagues remind me of Boaz. Now, some of you might perceive that our work is rescuing human trafficking victims who started out as vulnerable as Ruth and Naomi. But it goes deeper than that, because the same circumstances that brought them to this point are still there. Migration and human trafficking happen because of the cultural, social, economic, and political systems that allow it to happen. Nearly 10% of the Filipino population lives and works outside of the Philippines. Online sexual exploitation of children, commonly understood as the selling of children to perform sexual acts for a viewer through the internet, is sadly common among Filipino families and communities. And for as long as people are only treated as property, for as long as education is reserved for boys, for as long as people cannot live on the wages or the contracts or the multiple jobs, and for as long as parents and other trusted adults make money and provide for their families through online sex, and for as long as these adults don't consider online sex as sexual abuse, for as long as people pay for these online transactions, migration and human trafficking will always happen.